Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today we have our first review of a 500Hz QD-OLED monitor, the MSI MAG 272QP QD-OLED X50. Yes, that is the official name of the product. Yes, it's too long, and yes, the X50 part at the end is very important because that's the part that tells us this is a 500Hz monitor. The 272QP X50 isn't just a simple 27-inch 1440p QD-OLED with its refresh rate bumped up to 500Hz. There are two other new benefits we are getting. Samsung Display have increased the panel's VESA Display HDR certification tier from True Black 400 on all other QD-OLED monitors to True Black 500, meaning this panel should deliver a meaningful increase in brightness. To meet the True Black 500 spec, the screen must hit 300 nits full screen white and 500 nits at a 10% window, which would be higher than existing models. This is also the first monitor we've seen with MSI's new EOTF boost function, their second attempt at fixing QD-OLED panel dimming. The first attempt we looked at earlier this year, and it didn't really work, only resolving the problem in a narrow range of circumstances. MSI promises this new EOTF boost fix will be a better and broader solution, so we'll see how that goes later in the review. The X50 is also positioned to be one of the cheaper 500Hz monitors, debuting at $850 US. At Computex, most other vendors using this panel were targeting a $900 price, so if that remains true when other models launch, MSI will be coming in slightly cheaper. What is definitely true is 500Hz QD-OLED will launch into the market at a cheaper price than 480Hz WOLED monitors like the Asus PG27AQDP and LG 27GX790A, both of which have a $1,000 MSRP. However, while we are reviewing a final retail model for this review today, MSI tell us the X50 won't actually be available until late July in most regions. Today's video is brought to you by the Ugreen Nexode 500-watt desktop charger. I love Ugreen chargers. I've got them everywhere. I rely on them around the office and at home. Their latest product is the world's first 500-watt charging station. Up to 240 watts out of a single USB-C port on the top, a further 4 100-watt USB-C ports, and a USB-A for a total simultaneous power output of 500 watts. Powers 6 devices at once thanks to upgraded GaN Infinity chips, broad protocol compatibility, and 11 levels of safety protection. With a huge output capacity, you can fast charge 5 laptops at the same time, charge a 16-inch MacBook Pro to 60% in 30 minutes, and simplify your charging setup into a single unit. Check the links below to learn more about the Ugreen Nexode 500-watt fast charging station and grab one for yourself today. The design of the 272QP X50 is identical to other recent MSI gaming monitors. The front features the display panel with its normal glossy finish and a grey chin with the MSI logo. The rear features MSI's usual central box design, which houses all the display components. Extending outwards from the box is the thin OLED panel. The box section itself is made from a standard black plastic with a variety of textures and vents. It's a relatively gamery sort of design, however, there's no RGB LED lighting here. The build quality is reasonable but falls short of recent high-end Alienware monitors as an example. The stand has a flattish, squarish base that we've seen again for quite a few years now. The pillar supports height, tilt, swivel, and pivot adjustability and is very sturdy, which I like to see. The maximum height on offer is average. For port selection, we have one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, two HDMI 2.1 48GB/s ports with DSC, and a USB-C supporting DP alt mode and 15 watts of power delivery. There's also a 3.5mm audio out, but no USB hub and therefore no KVM switch either. A bit of a surprise given most other MSI monitors include KVM functionality. However, there will be a second variant of this monitor launching a few months later. It's the MPG271QR X50, which upgrades the DisplayPort to 2.1 UHBR20 spec, adds in a USB hub, and bumps the power delivery up to 98 watts on the USB-C port. As things stand though, unless you really wanted a USB hub or KVM switch, I think the port selection is fine, and the choice to use DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC is a non-issue. Practically speaking, you won't notice any difference in usability over a DisplayPort 2.1 version. There are no functionality issues with DP 1.4 on this display, as you can achieve 10-bit 500Hz over both DisplayPort and HDMI, though in both cases DSC is required. For console gamers, this display supports 1080p and 1440p input at up to 120Hz with HDMI VRR. There is no 4K downscaling mode available. The OSD is controllable through a directional toggle behind the MSI logo, and it includes a pretty typical MSI feature set, including a solid range of color controls, various different color modes, and gaming features like a crosshair sniper mode, refresh rate counter, black boosting, and so on. MSI also offer the best range of adjustable OLED care features, allowing you to enable or disable specific features like static screen detection and taskbar detection, as well as adjusting how strongly these features are implemented. While there are no USB ports on this monitor, firmware updates are still supported over DisplayPort. While the 272QP X50 uses a new 500Hz QD-OLED panel from Samsung Display, the underlying hardware technology is the same as previous 27-inch 1440p QD-OLED panels that were available at 360 and 240Hz refresh rates. No changes to the subpixel structure, panel composition, or screen coding. As such, this is still a third-generation panel. With no changes to the subpixel layout, it still uses the revised version of Triangle RGB. Text clarity is the same as other 1440p QD-OLEDs. Compared to LCDs at the same size and resolution, QD-OLED isn't as strong for text rendering as it produces some pink-green fringing at the top and bottom of text. This may or may not be noticeable depending on how sensitive you are to artifacts. Text clarity is on par with 480Hz WOLED panels that use an RGWB subpixel layout, although the artifacts you see are different. Compared to older WOLED panels though, the 240Hz versions that use an RWBG layout, QD-OLED has an advantage in text quality. This QD-OLED panel is glossy, which is a double-edged sword. The main benefit is increased sharpness and clarity compared to matte coatings, with no coating grain or light diffusion that can impact apparent contrast. The downsides are mirror-like reflections, which are well managed on this panel compared to some glossy finishes, and QD-OLED ambient light reflection. In brighter environments, QD-OLED panels can appear grey instead of black when displaying black, as ambient light activates the quantum dot layer. This reduces black depth in well-lit rooms and hurts the black level advantage you get from OLED, but the issue can be mitigated by ensuring your room is dimly lit with light sources behind the display. Whether QD-OLED glossy is the right choice for you is dependent on your personal preferences and usage conditions. OLED panels of all varieties are also susceptible to permanent burn-in. You won't get burn-in while playing games or watching videos, but the panel will burn in over time when displaying static content for long periods. This makes OLED less well suited for productivity uses where you'll be looking at static desktop apps all day. And you can check out our ongoing burn-in series to see how real-world productivity use affects burn-in. The occasional amount of static app usage is fine, so don't worry about doing a bit of web browsing between gaming sessions. I just wouldn't recommend OLED as a monitor for hours of work. MSI offer an industry standard 3-year burn-in warranty. Response time performance is excellent on this QD-OLED monitor, as it is for other OLED displays we've tested so far. OLED offers lightning fast response times around the 0.3 millisecond mark at all refresh rates, and performance doesn't change at lower refresh rates, one of the many benefits of OLED for variable refresh rate gamers. This results in a single overdrive mode experience where you don't need to adjust settings depending on the refresh rate you are using. There is effectively no difference in response time performance between this QD-OLED and other OLED monitors, including WOLED variants. OLEDs are much faster than even the fastest LCDs I've tested, and this is true whether we look at the best performance or average performance across the refresh rate range. Not only are OLEDs fast, they also have no overshoot artifacts, which can be an issue with some LCD models. When viewing cumulative deviation results, we can see that OLEDs get much closer to ideal response time behavior, and in most cases offer performance an order of magnitude better in this metric than LCDs. In practice, this leads to around a 1.5 times advantage in clarity at a given refresh rate. So 500Hz QD-OLEDs offer a similar experience to 750Hz LCDs, which currently don't exist at this resolution. In regular usage conditions, especially with features like Adaptive Sync and HDR enabled, this is one of the fastest, smoothest, and clearest monitors you can get. Aside from comparisons to LCDs, the main thing you need to be aware of when buying an OLED for motion is that clarity on these panels is directly tied to refresh rate. At the same refresh rate, two different OLED monitors will look basically the same, so the actual refresh rate you'll be using is more important than the maximum refresh rate of the monitor. If you compare two OLEDs, one with a 500Hz max refresh and one with a 240Hz max refresh, but both are playing games at 120 FPS with a 120Hz refresh rate, they will look the same and give the same experience. Where higher refresh rate OLEDs become of benefit is when you are using the highest refresh rate capabilities. Running an OLED at 500Hz produces a clearer image than at 240Hz with better smoothness and responsiveness. This is the key benefit this new MSI monitor brings compared to older QD-OLEDs that topped out at 360 or 240Hz. This has advantages when gaming at high frame rates, for example multiplayer games or games with frame generation enabled. But a higher refresh OLED only has an advantage when you exceed the refresh rate of a lower refresh model. In this example, a 500Hz QD-OLED will be better than a 240Hz QD-OLED when gaming at anywhere between 241 and 500 FPS with variable refresh enabled. Anything at or below 240 FPS, there will be no difference, so keep this in mind when shopping between OLEDs because 500Hz commands a hefty premium that you might otherwise not benefit from. It's hard to make a call on whether you need a 500Hz display instead of something with a lower refresh rate. Personally, I think the biggest reason to get a panel like this is for multiplayer gaming, where you are more likely to be playing at high frame rates and where the significant motion clarity and input lag difference compared to 240Hz makes the experience better. Sometimes these sorts of panels have been labeled as diminishing returns, but personally I think they present quite a noticeable upgrade, and that's coming from someone that doesn't play tons of fast-paced titles. At the same time though, 500Hz over 240Hz isn't essential for a great gaming experience in the way that 120Hz is over 60Hz. The other important comparison to make is to this panel's direct competitor, 480Hz WOLED. Now this QD-OLED at 500Hz is 20Hz faster, which to me is more of a marketing tool that allows display makers to claim this is the fastest OLED or whatever. In practice, it's virtually impossible to notice a clarity difference between 480Hz and 500Hz, and the input lag advantage is negligible. The only legitimate challenger to a 500Hz OLED in motion clarity at the moment would be a 540Hz LCD with backlight strobing enabled, such as the PG-248QP. It's actually a lot closer than I thought it would be, but in edge case scenarios, especially super fast motion, a strobed LCD does deliver superior clarity. With that said, backlight strobing on something like the PG-248QP is highly restrictive. You have to sacrifice variable refresh rates and HDR, you have to run your game at a locked frame rate that matches the refresh rate for it to work properly, and typically we only see this performance from TN LCDs, which have other issues like viewing angles. The MSI X50 gives you great motion clarity in a much broader range of conditions, making it a big winner. MSI have added a black frame insertion mode to this monitor called MPRT, but it doesn't work the same way as the same feature on Asus OLED, which is called ELMB. On the 272QP X50, enabling MPRT simply drops every second frame to black. So if you're in the 500Hz mode with MPRT enabled, every second frame is black instead of displayed. This effectively gives the monitor a 250Hz refresh, except it still appears to your PC as 500Hz, meaning if you are running at a higher frame rate, those frames simply won't be displayed. And this applies to every refresh down to 240Hz, which still drops every second frame for an effective 120Hz refresh. It can't be used at a normal 120Hz refresh rate. In contrast, Asus ELMB changes the monitor configuration, so when you enable it at 240Hz, the panel runs at 480Hz and inserts a black frame between each real frame, but it appears to your PC like a 240Hz monitor and the feature can't be enabled when the monitor is set to 480Hz. Now, you can use MSI's MPRT mode to get the same effect as Asus ELMB, but it relies on manual PC side tweaks. For example, you would have to enable MPRT in the 500Hz mode, then manually cap your in-game frame rate to 250 FPS, so you get the effect of black frame insertion at 250Hz. On the Asus monitor, this is easier because the real refresh rate of the monitor is matching the refresh rate that Windows can see. You don't have to worry about setting the frame rate to half of what is reported to Windows. The MSI mode also has the potential to confuse gamers who, for example, want to play at 240Hz with black frame insertion. If you set the refresh rate to 240Hz, then enable MPRT, it doesn't give you 240Hz black frame insertion. It drops every second frame and gives you 120Hz black frame insertion, giving you no increase in motion clarity for your 240 FPS content. To achieve 240Hz black frame insertion, you first have to raise the refresh rate mode to 480Hz, then enable MPRT. I think MSI should simplify this mode to make it run more like the Asus implementation because it has less potential to confuse people and just makes a lot more sense. Measuring input lag here, we can see what sort of difference the refresh rate makes. Compared to the PG27A there is basically no difference in the refresh lag component and a small margin of error difference in total lag. You'll also spot that while input lag is improved compared to 360Hz panels, we're talking about fractions of a millisecond in average lag. It's only up against 240Hz panels, where input lag is nearly twice as high, that astute users will feel a difference. Also of note is the 540Hz TN-based PG-248QP, which struggles to match OLED due to a higher processing delay and slower response times. Power consumption in a full white window is very similar to other 1440p QD-OLEDs at 68 watts, so pretty much the same as some of the previous 360Hz models. However, in full white content like this, WOLED does have an advantage thanks to the white subpixel, so the PG27A uses about 10 watts less. In real-world gaming content though, one of the interesting things I've found is that the refresh rate plays a big part in overall power consumption on both QD-OLED and WOLED. The 272QP X50 uses nearly 10 watts more in our mid-APL SDR gaming test at 500Hz compared to 240Hz, and this is why the monitor uses more power than the 360Hz and 240Hz QD-OLEDs in this chart. In a reversal of what we see at full white though, 500Hz QD-OLED in this test is actually more efficient than 480Hz WOLED, which also sees a large power increase going from 240Hz to 480Hz. All QD-OLEDs that we've tested so far offer a similar color space. This new 500Hz model does not improve color space coverage in any significant way. We're looking at 99.5% DCI-P3 coverage as well as 98% Adobe RGB coverage, strong results for viewing HDR content or working in those color spaces. In total, I saw 82.1% coverage of Rec 2020, which is a good result for a QD-OLED monitor and gaming monitors in general, though not all that different to other QD-OLED models. The X50 has OK factory calibration with a fantastic color temperature and average gamma out of the box, leading to a reasonable grayscale delta E ITP average. In saturation and color checker, we see oversaturation by default, as SDR sRGB content is expanded to fill the wide gamut of this monitor. This is especially noticeable on a QD-OLED panel because of its inherently wide color gamut. Compared to other monitors in both grayscale and color checker, we see average results, with MSI's previous 360Hz flagship offering better performance. When enabling Windows Auto Color Management, we see OK results, definitely a big reduction in oversaturation thanks to better sRGB color space emulation. However, the primaries the display reports aren't perfect, so instead of this mode giving us 100% coverage of sRGB, it's more like 110%, largely due to the red part of the spectrum. It's better than default for SDR, but not as good as some other displays. On the other hand, the sRGB mode is very good. Grayscale performance improves thanks to better gamma, leading to lower delta E's with no impact to the excellent factory color temperature. Saturation and color checker results are also better, with delta E averages below 4.0. While this mode is very good, so are many other sRGB modes on the market today, so this MSI 500Hz monitor still ends up sitting in the middle of the pack. Color checker results are good, but not at the outstanding level of the 271QRX. It is possible to improve performance through a full calibration, but in my opinion, with this monitor, it isn't really that necessary in the SDR mode. I would largely just use the sRGB mode as it comes from the factory, although I would have preferred if settings like white balance were unlocked, just in case I needed to change it. The 272QP X50 is the first QD-OLED monitor I've seen to break away from the pack in terms of maximum HDR brightness. This panel now offers 302 nits full screen white, an upgrade from the 240 to 260 nits we received from this panel type previously. This seems to be a genuine attempt from Samsung Display to increase OLED brightness and achieve a higher display HDR tier. A 20% improvement compared to other OLEDs is great news for those that want higher OLED brightness, and while it still falls short of most other LCDs, every bit counts to make this panel more usable in brighter environments and to cut through reflections. Minimum brightness is unchanged as well, with MSI offering the same 30 nits as their other products. Viewing angles are also basically the same as other QD-OLED panels, so they are excellent, making this panel easy to view. Uniformity was also very good with my unit, nice and uniform viewing full white and no dirty screen effect viewing dark greys. This is keeping QD-OLED in the leadership position for display uniformity among OLEDs. The 272QP X50 is well suited to HDR from a hardware perspective. OLED panels including QD-OLED directly emit light and have individual pixel control, which makes them ideal for displaying HDR content. This feature allows each pixel to independently vary from fully switching off to displaying bright highlights, giving us deep zero-level blacks and per-pixel local dimming. The level of control OLEDs provide minimizes blooming in high contrast scenarios and allows for clean distinction between bright and dark areas that are close together. Compared to LCDs with a multi-zone backlight, OLEDs have far fewer ugly illumination artifacts, which are most noticeable when displaying difficult scenarios, like star fields or subtitles, and there are no zone transitions as bright objects move around the display. With per-pixel control as its main advantage, OLEDs are best at displaying high-contrast scenes with rich shadow detail, which is a key aspect to a good HDR presentation. Darker content interspersed with dazzling bright highlights brings out the best in OLED displays, as does HDR content with fast motion. For gamers especially, input latency on most OLEDs is low in the HDR mode. The weakness to the HDR presentation on an OLED is overall brightness. While peak brightness can be high in the best cases, full screen brightness is still pretty low, and this limits the punch in bright daytime scenes. LCDs may not have per-pixel control, but zoned backlights can simply get significantly brighter in bright scenes. Depending on what you want out of an HDR monitor, your preference could swing more towards LCDs or more towards OLEDs, but typically speaking, OLEDs are a great choice that deliver a fantastic HDR presentation. This monitor includes 3 HDR modes, a True Black 500 mode, a Peak 1000 nits mode, and a new EOTF boost mode. All 3 modes perform differently to previous QD-OLED monitors that had similarly named modes. The True Black 500 and Peak 1000 nit modes are both brighter, as this panel is brighter in general, and the EOTF boost mode is MSI's latest attempt at fixing QD-OLED panel dimming in brighter scenes, so let's run through how they perform. The True Black 500 mode is similar to True Black 400 modes on other QD-OLEDs, except instead of capping overall brightness to around 460 nits, this mode is capped to 530 nits. That's a 15% boost to peak brightness while largely retaining the accuracy this mode is known for. EOTF tracking is very good in most circumstances, though I did spot some panel dimming in brighter scenes, a surprise for this mode. The level of dimming isn't too bad in tests like a 10% window at constant APL 50, but it was a bit worse using our mystery test pattern. The Peak 1000 nits mode is similar to other QD-OLED Peak 1000 modes, except brightness at most window sizes has increased. Peak brightness is unchanged, we're still getting around 1000 nits at a 2% window, but at a 10% window, for example, we're now seeing 530 nits instead of 460 nits. Panel dimming is still present in this mode, leading to lower screen brightness when content APL is high. APL refers to average picture level, a proxy for the average brightness of the content being displayed. QD-OLED panels in their Peak 1000 modes dim bright scenes for some silly reason, apparently due to power management, even though these same scenes are displayed with higher brightness in the True Black mode. In any case, the level of dimming here is much more severe than using the True Black 500 mode, but EOTF tracking in lower APL scenes is very good. MSI's new EOTF boost mode is the most interesting of the configurations. Essentially, this mode is MSI's attempt at dynamically reversing the panel dimming found in the Peak 1000 mode, creating a new mode that gives the benefits of both the True Black and Peak 1000 configurations at the same time. The goal is to preserve 1000 nits of brightness in darker scenes and correct levels of brightness in brighter scenes, without the user having to change modes like has been the case on previous QD-OLED monitors. MSI's first attempt at this didn't work very well, only reversing panel dimming around 10% of the time in real scenarios. But this new EOTF boost mode is much more successful, and there are genuinely times where this configuration reverses panel dimming. Across our main tests, I found great EOTF tracking at smaller window, lower APL tests while retaining 1000 nits of peak brightness. I found no panel dimming in higher APL tests like 10% APL 50, and even in our high APL mystery test. The results look very good and indicate a successful mode without panel dimming. MSI's previous attempt failed our mystery pattern test. However, in real-world scenarios, the EOTF boost mode can still produce panel dimming. It's just less likely to occur than in the Peak 1000 mode. Where this mode works the best is when scenes are either on the darker end of the scale or on the brighter end. In both of these situations, accuracy is good and scenes look normal without dimming. Around the transition point between low and high APL, the point at which the Peak 1000 mode begins to implement panel dimming, the EOTF boost mode has a much harder time reversing dimming, and in these border cases, we still do find some dimming is occurring. The reality is this mode from MSI is a hack. It's trying to override the panel dimming, which is still happening in the background, by brightening the image as the panel dims, instead of just removing the panel dimming. This hack is more successful in some situations than others. I was able to observe these struggles in real time in situations where a scene transitions from bright to dark or vice versa. For example, here is the dark Steam library interface with a bright window on top in the EOTF Boost HDR mode. When the bright window is small, overall panel brightness is mid-range and normal looking. As I drag the window to become larger, brightness begins to dip up to a certain point, after which this trend reverses the other way and the panel becomes brighter. During that period before brightness increases again, panel dimming is occurring. If you do the same thing in the Peak 1000 mode, you get noticeable dimming, which remains dimmed throughout the transition between bright and dark. In the True Black 500 mode, you get more consistent brightness with a small amount of dimming at the largest window size. Where this can play out in actual gaming scenarios is when you're transitioning between a darker and brighter scene. Here in Cyberpunk, as I walk between a more shadowed area outside and a less shadowed area outside, you can see the panel dynamically changing its brightness level, almost like a camera changing its exposure. In some situations where you're constantly changing scene brightness like this, the fluctuating panel brightness can be distracting. In other situations where brightness is more consistent as you move around, the EOTF boost mode is a great way to ensure the best HDR experience is being delivered. Ultimately, with a few tweaks to my mystery pattern, I was able to reproduce panel dimming behavior in a test situation, so the EOTF boost mode is not the perfect solution. But so far, it's the best solution I've seen, with fewer compromises than other brightness boosting modes, which either don't work at all or significantly over-brighten dark scenes. It will take some experimentation with the game you're playing as to whether its dynamic behavior is right for that game, and I do want to be clear here, there are definitely games I played where I did not like how visible and distracting the brightness shifting is. I think a third iteration of this brightness boost algorithm could make this sort of system much more usable though. Fixing up that mid-APL transition point to further remove dimming in that zone, as well as making the algorithm a bit less sensitive so that brightness transitions are less obvious, that would make the mode more broadly usable. Alternatively, MSI could offer some sort of sensitivity setting so users could adjust how dynamic the mode is. Ultimately though, while Samsung Display continue to mandate panel dimming as part of their power management solution, which I believe is why we see panel dimming across all QD-OLEDs, it will be up to manufacturers like MSI to refine their hacks to reverse it, and this latest EOTF boost mode is better, but still not quite there yet. We saw higher SDR brightness from the 272QP X50 compared to other QD-OLEDs, and the same is true in HDR brightness. Full screen white brightness across all three modes is up to 315 nits now, a 20% increase over previous QD-OLEDs. 10% window brightness has also risen to around 530 nits, a 15% increase over previous models. Meanwhile, in the Peak 1000 type configurations, peak brightness is unchanged and remains in the 1000 nit range. When looking at brightness versus window size and comparing that to previous True Black 400 certified QD-OLEDs, it's really only the smallest windows where we see no improvements. Even at a 5% window size, we're seeing a gain from around 770 nits to 820 nits, with the highest gains I saw in the 25% range. This makes this 500Hz QD-OLED the brightest QD-OLED yet. This has a noticeable impact in real-world scenes. Here I'm looking at a select few monitors in their various configurations. Comparing the Peak 1000 mode on the X50 to the Peak 1000 mode on the 271QP X-E2, we see average real scene brightness is increased by 18%, which makes it more competitive with the PG27 AQDP. Both modes across these QD-OLEDs have similar levels of panel dimming and accuracy, while the PG27 AQDP is free of this issue. The True Black 500 mode is also more viable than previous QD-OLED's True Black 400 modes. This config is 18% brighter in our testing and retains a similar level of accuracy with a small regression in overall dimming. This means average brightness is now similar to other QD-OLED's Peak 1000 modes, but obviously there is a large split between high and low APL content, which doesn't make them the same. 500 nits peak is still on the low side for dark scenes, but with mid-APL content now reaching 450 nits, this is much higher than previous panel-dimmed QD-OLEDs. The EOTF boost mode stands atop the chart with an average peak brightness of 562 nits, the highest we've seen from an OLED. This configuration is 7% brighter than the PG27 AQDP overall in our tests, largely due to higher brightness in low APL content. With that said, again, this mode can produce some panel dimming, though the level of dimming is less than the Peak 1000 mode, and both low and high APL accuracy is good. Just be aware of the dynamic behavior I described earlier, as that can affect your experience even if the results look good in this table. HDR accuracy is very good, with MSI offering a great experience in all three modes. Color match performance using the 1000 nits mode is more mid-table, but the other two modes provide excellent accuracy. As peak brightness is unchanged, overall color volume is unchanged compared to other QD-OLEDs in their peak configuration. Last section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. MSI do a good job of advertising this monitor, and the jump up to VESA Display HDR True Black 500 certification has led to a real increase in specifications like full screen brightness. The feature support matrix shows a typically strong showing in the contrast and motion sections, as you would expect from a 500Hz OLED panel. BFI is supported, although the way MSI has configured it is a little unusual, but ultimately does allow for 120Hz and 240Hz black frame insertion. While this is a higher end monitor, it's not MSI's flagship offering using this panel. That will be the 271QP X50 coming in a few months, which is why we don't see features like a USB hub or KVM switch on this monitor. That's a little disappointing considering the price, but it's good to see firmware upgrades have been retained, as are other essentials like graceful SDR HDR switching. Overall, the MSI MAG 272QP QD-OLED X50 is a much more interesting monitor than expected. At first glance, you might think this is a simple iterative increase on previous 1440p QD-OLEDs that bumps the maximum refresh rate from 360 to 500Hz. But on top of that, we're actually seeing a meaningful increase in panel brightness in both the SDR and HDR modes, along with MSI's latest attempt at fixing panel dimming. The results make this one of the best QD-OLED monitors we've tested to date. A lot of the X50's key strengths are things we've talked about extensively before in other OLED reviews. This display has excellent black depth, fantastic per pixel control, a very wide color gamut, and outstanding contrast, which leads to a beautiful HDR gaming experience. MSI have done a decent job of calibrating both the SDR and HDR modes to provide a strong level of color accuracy, and gamers benefit from low input lag regardless of the operating conditions. OLED panels are well known for their speed, and the 272QP is no exception, providing lightning-fast response times at a very high refresh rate, which produces amazing motion clarity. This is a great display for single-player gaming, but the gamers set to benefit the most are those that play fast-paced competitive titles. This is the ultimate OLED monitor for competitive gamers because the motion clarity and responsiveness is just that good, and it achieves this while retaining support for adaptive sync and HDR. Yes, the best strobed LCDs can be a little clearer, but OLEDs are far more versatile and far less compromised in other areas. What the X50 brings to the table that we haven't seen before is higher panel brightness across the board. Maximum SDR brightness now hits 300 nits full screen, and the HDR modes are around 18% brighter on average than previous QD-OLEDs in real-world content. While peak HDR brightness remains at 1000 nits in lower APL scenes, it's those mid to high APL scenes that benefit noticeably from the brightness boost, and this is key because the weakest area to OLED performance has been those sorts of brighter scenes. The panel itself is unchanged from previous models in terms of subpixel layout and screen coding, so don't expect any improvements on that front. Panel dimming is also still a problem with the latest QD-OLEDs, though MSI have done the best job we've seen so far of working around this with their new EOTF boost mode. It's a bit of a hack and it doesn't always work well, but if the conditions are right, it can reverse panel dimming in a way that previous attempts haven't achieved. At $850 US, this is a premium monitor, and it's not going to be the best choice for a lot of gamers. If you're primarily a single-player gamer that wants a top-end display for HDR, I'd consider the latest 27-inch and 32-inch 4K 240Hz panels, which are a similar price. Alternatively, if you want to remain at 1440p but you aren't going to use the highest 500Hz refresh rate capabilities, you can save quite a bit of money going with a similar, lower refresh rate OLED instead. 360Hz models are around $650 US these days, so a good $200 cheaper than the X50, and 240Hz has begun hitting the $500 to $550 mark. Yes, you'll also lose out on the latest brightness advantages, but for some gamers it's hard to justify spending 50% more on this newest MSI just for that. On the other hand, you should definitely consider spending $850 on the 272QP X50 if you want the best motion clarity on the market. Previously, to get this level of clarity in a 1440p OLED, you've had to spend $950 to $1,000 US on a 480Hz WOLED model. $850 is a better deal for what is ultimately a very similar motion experience. On top of this, the X50 has a range of other benefits a monitor like the Asus PG27A doesn't provide, such as a glossy finish, higher SDR brightness, and better color volume. Now, this particular MSI monitor isn't set to be available until late July, and we're also expecting other variants to launch soon from brands like Asus and Gigabyte, so it will probably make sense to check reviews for other variants before deciding on which monitor to buy. But this MSI variant is definitely setting a high standard to begin with, and if you do buy one, I think you'll be very happy with how it performs. So anyway, that's it for this extensive review of the MSI 272QP X50. We will have some other 500Hz OLED monitor reviews coming later down the line. I don't actually have any of them right now to do testing on, so you'll have to wait a couple of months to see those other ones, I would think. But yeah, the first 500Hz QD-OLED, some interesting advancements for this particular panel, especially when it comes to brightness. If you want to support our independent monitor testing right here at Monitors Unboxed, then consider supporting us through our Patreon page. Links to that is in the description below. If you sign up, you'll get access to some pretty cool benefits like our ICC profiles and calibrated settings for all the monitors that we test. We also have a Discord community, great place to chat about monitors, get advice and recommendations, and plenty of other good stuff is available there. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.